All right, welcome back to the third portion of the April meeting for the Hampton Ship Model Society. We've done the business portion and show and tell. Now Gene Andes is going to give us a presentation on building his whaleboat. Is it Daisy? Whaling ship Daisy?
Daisy. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Can you see the slide?
Nope, if you're sharing your screen, all we're seeing is your face at the moment.
Oh, let me try again. The share screen again.
Okay, Gene has started screen sharing. There we go. Starting to see it now.
Showing up now?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the story of a ship, the Daisy, and the model I built of Daisy. I got interested in it when I was researching whaling, and I decided to build a model that illustrated the process as much as the ship itself. And I found out about the Daisy when I discovered books written by a fellow named Robert Murphy, who was a naturalist who had sailed aboard the Daisy in a voyage 1912, 1913 down to the Antarctic. So a little bit about, this is what the model looked like. I made it when done. It's a diorama, and it shows the process of cutting in a whale or removing the blubber from the whale, which I guess this is the way things were done before liposuction was invented. The Daisy itself was originally built as a merchant vessel, built in 1872 on Long Island for a ship's chandlery in New York City for the fruit trade in the West Indies. There's not a lot of hard facts about her size. The tonnage that's quoted varies quite a bit, anywhere from 384 tons to over 400 tons. So I took Murphy's estimate, since he was actually aboard the ship rather than the one from the newspaper article, and I pegged her at about 370, 380 tons. And I did some calculations later when I'd done the lines and got something pretty close to that. In 1907, she was purchased by a group in New Bedford, converted to a whaler. They revised the organization of the boat to add the whaling equipment, but also the complement increased greatly to anywhere from 34 to 38 men from probably 8 or 10 before. Daisy came to a rather sad end. She was converted back to a merchant ship in 1915, carrying a load of beans to Europe. World War I, sprang a leak, the beans swelled and burst her seams, and she sank. I was not able to find plans of the Daisy. There were a lot of photographs in one of the books by Murphy that were helpful. And I found a picture of one model of the Daisy, but it was clearly as a merchant vessel, as evidenced by the lack of whaleboats and davits. So I had to do some reconstruction. First thing I did, I worked up some lines. As a jumping off point, I used the lines from the ship Lagoda, which is, there's a half-size model of Lagoda at New Bedford Whaling Museum. And the Lagoda was also a merchant ship converted to a whaler. Lagoda was built in 1826. She was converted to a whale ship in 1841 and then converted back to a merchant ship back about 1886. She was originally ship-rigged, converted to a bark. Her tonnage, she was rated at anywhere from 340 to 370 tons with a length of 107 feet. So she was about the same size as the Daisy. a little bit shorter perhaps, but the tonnage wasn't much different. So I used her profile, and based on pictures of the Daisy, I could see that at least in the middle part, she was pretty straightforward merchant vessel with very upright sides, a lot of freeboard, no tumble home. The difference between the Daisy and the Lagoda was stem and stern. Daisy had more like a schooner stern with an oval transom, and her front was a bit sharper with flagged bows and a sharper entry. So I drew up these lines, and these are the lines I used to build the model. Once the model was done, I went back and corrected the lines. I got a few things wrong when I went back and judged the photographs. So I redrew the lines, but these are the ones used for the model. Whale ships, there were some differences. Whale ships had a very deep keel because they spent so much time just drifting. So I made the keel deeper. And then one of the errors I made was getting too much rake to the stem post, which I corrected. Once I had the lines, I then worked up a deck arrangement based mostly on photographs and contemporary practices. Since whaleboats were asymmetric, being different port and starboard, I did inboard and outboard profiles for both sides. Then I worked up masting and spar plans for the foremast and mainmast. She was a hermaphrodite rig, and they retained that rig when she was converted to a whale ship. Then I worked up a sail plan, and I based the sail plan originally on a photograph from the New Bedford Whaling Museum of Daisy, which was dated to 1909 and was reported to be a refit after the 1909 voyage. But that was incorrect in that it showed only a single jib stay. And actually, Daisy had 2 jib stays. So I revised my sail plan, amended it with 2 jib stays. And going back and checking photographs, this was more consistent with what the ship looked like in 1912. And the picture from the museum was just misstated. It was actually during her 1907 refit, because when I went back and looked more carefully under magnification, she only had a few of her davits and they were unpainted. So I think she was just becoming a whale ship. I also drew up detailed plans, about 25 plans that were details on the equipment and the rigging. I also started to keep notes to prepare a builder's notebook. It ended up about 45 pages of notes in which I could explain why I did what I did and where I wasn't sure, and so on and so forth. Here are some of the typical detailed drawings. Once I had those done and the rigging plan, I could calculate rigging dimensions, worked up a chart for that. And when I did that, I also calculated out how I would make the various lines up from various cotton cord. And then I hauled my rope machine out of the closet, and I spent a few weeks making the cordage for it, some rope, some cable, depending. The hull construction was pretty straightforward. It was my sort of modified Han method upside down. It was pretty straightforward, though, from 3/16 solid core Luan. I took the stations, which when I drew the profile, I placed them an inch apart, so that was easy. And I flip copied them, pasted them together, and then I could cut out the stations profiles right from that. The red line is what I would, I guess, call the Han line. That's where the building board is going to be. So all I had to do was extend the bulkhead to that line to have them fit on the board. This is what the assembly looked like. Pretty straightforward. You see it erected on the building board, which is also of Luan, and then it was planked. Then I painted it, put on some copper, oxidized the copper various ways to age it. Then I cut the hull free and trimmed the bulkheads down to the level of the planking. In the middle portion of the waist, I trimmed the bulkheads down further down to the plank shear. Because to expose the bulwarks in the inside, I reinforced where I'd cut the bulkheads out with some 16th inch pine. Here you see the first layer of planking going on. I used 16th inch basswood for that. And then I followed with a second layer of planking of maple, 16 inch thick, 1/8 inch wide. leaving, and that's what created the waterway in the main deck. As part of the process and part of figuring out the Gallant forecastle, I had to figure out the windlass. There was a windlass shown, but there was also a capstan shown, and the capstan was placed well forward of the windlass. Kind of didn't make sense. So I did some internet research, and I found that around that time there were various combination units, which were capstans and windlass combinations. And one could drive the other. In some cases, the capstan drove the windlass. In some cases, the rocker on the windlass drove the capstan. And in other cases, they were all steam driven. But every illustration I found, the capstan was almost always located directly over the windlass. So it turned out that when they restored the CA Thayer in San Francisco, they had the same problem, and they ended up deciding they were just simply separate devices. So I took that course. Here, I'm beginning to detail the Gallant forecastle. You can see the windlass and the capstan, which is well forward, too far forward to handle the anchor chain. So I'm not sure what it did, but I guess they had the same problem with the Thayer. Here I've cut away the removable bowler, started to add details on the deck. The quarterdeck railing is in place. So I started to do the rigging. I left the masts natural, which is the way they looked in photographs. So that I'm here, I'm setting up the standing rigging. So then I was ready to do the running rigging. So I planned a belaying pin diagram, roughed it out, and then fine-tuned it as I actually did the rigging. This is for the pin rails on the main deck, the Gallant forecastle, some fair leads on the shrouds. That's what the F numbers are, and a spider pin rail in the foremast. There were also pins in the quarterdeck rail, so I put those in and numbered them and figured that out more or less on the fly. Next step was to put some made sails. I made a full set of sails, and I put the sails, the head sails and the foremast sails on, left off any rigging that was going to be in the way of detailing the deck, and went ahead and proceeded to work on the details while I could still reach them before I boxed them in with whaleboats and davits or rigging. So the order of construction was a little bit different than usual. Here is some of the detailing. That's the Gallant forecastle with the crew working the rocker arm for the windlass. You can see the ropes coming off the windlass leading up. That leads up to the cutting in tackle, which you'll see in a minute. But you can see it'd be pretty hard to work on those things if you had sheets and braces in your way. So I left them off till later. Then I did a little segue to start to do the sub-assemblies. There's the whaleboat and its equipment and a gazillion davits and bearing beams. And at that point, I needed to put it on its base, because the next step was to make the whale and use the position of the whale to establish the level of the cutting stage, which also determined where the cutting tackle and that sort of thing went. And this is the start of the base. It's simply 1/8" acrylic textured with fast setting epoxy. I stuck a shark on one end, and painted the bottom of Luan in dark colors. And then once that was done, the top of the sea was the same. It was 1/8" acrylic framed with 1" oak. And then I textured that using quickset pouring epoxy with multiple layers, incorporating plastic wrap and various dyes to create the desired effect. And here's what it ended up looking like. And here are some of the sharks I did. There were about 6 sharks feeding on the whale carcass. You can see the bloody whale carcass where the blubber's being stripped off of it in the background. And the other sharks are elsewhere in the water making off with lunch. And here's what it looked like towards the end or at conclusion. This is the port side. You can see the whaleboats are there. The aftermost whaleboat is being unloaded. The gear is strewn on the cabin roof. in the waist, you can see the men cutting up the blubber and pushing it down into the main hatch to what's called the blubber parlor, where it would be stored until the boiling of the blubber began, which is usually the day after the whale was cut in. There's another closer view of the gear. I was aiming for the sort of cluttered look. My goal was to make it as cluttered looking as my workbench, but I fell well short of that. This is another view showing the crew cutting the blubber up with cutting spades, coming around the bow, port bow, starboard bow. You can see the blood in the water on the starboard side. Also on the starboard side, the first set of davits is given over to carrying a little fisherman's dory, which was Robert Cushman Murphy's personal dory that he brought along. So Daisy only carried 4 whaleboats plus a spare on whisker booms at the stern. Some vessels carried more. You can see where the cutting stage has been lowered out over the whale carcass, which is floating in the water. The blubber strip is being pulled up by the cutting tackle, which is massive gear that literally just ripped the blubber off the whale. The whale was secured by a chain around the narrows, which was the tail just in front of the flukes, through a hawse hole towards the bow. And that allowed the whale to rotate in the water as they stripped the blubber off in what they call a blanket piece, which is about 4 or 5 feet wide. Once that was pulled off, as far as the tackle would take it, they put holes in the next below where they were going to cut it, put the secondary tackle through those holes to hold it, and then they cut the first piece free and swung it across the deck, where it was lowered onto the deck and chopped up into pieces that went into the blubber parlor. Later, they brought it out of the blubber parlor, cut it into smaller pieces, then used a mincing knife to mince them into what they called Bibles, and then they threw that in the tripod to cook out the oil. And these events all happened on separate days. So the whale hunt would be one day, cutting in would be another day, or 2 or 3, depending on how many whales. And then they would cook 24/7 the day after they'd finished cutting in. Here you can see what it looks like on the starboard side with the cutting stage in place and the bloody water. Here are the men on the cutting stage. This is the cutting tackle. On the left, you see the blubber hook and the blubber toggle, which is a chain with a wooden toggle. And on the right, you can see the single blocks of the cutting in tackle, which are on very large ropes, which were then lashed to the masthead. Exerted a tremendous amount of force. There was one ship, the Greyhound, that was cutting in a whale in rather heavy weather, and she actually sprung the seams on her port side below the chain plates and had to head home quickly with the pumps running 24 hours a day until they made it back. This is another shot from the front looking back. You can see the try works, which are still stowed at this point. The chimneys are lowered, laid on top of the cauldrons and covered with canvas. Another shot looking at the sort of general organization. And on the right, you see Robert Cushman Murphy with his Graflex camera taking pictures of the process. And Daisy is now headed for home. That's pretty much it for the presentation. Greg has a longer version, and the source material is on there. One piece of source material here, which is a block from my personal collection, which is stropped the way the Daisy's blocks were in photographs. I didn't strop my blocks in the running rigging this way just because I couldn't figure out how to do it, because they were so small. I stropped them with rope in the more usual fashion. That's about it.
Thank you very much, Gene. When you sent the 70 to 100 slide presentation, I was worried it would take too long, but I actually think you rushed through it a little bit fast. You could have spent even more time. It looks really good. But
Beautiful work. Really beautiful work.
And a great deal of good, solid research.
Yeah, well, it was a delay loop to my program. With the pandemic, I was completing models too fast and completed about 4 steamboats in the course of the pandemic. And I got pretty strict orders from the first mate that this kind of thing just had to stop. So I began the project in August, and the first part of the project was actually to build a whaleboat. I built the Model Shipways whaleboat kit, which was very instructive in terms of the process. And I did a lot of reading. And then by the time, it takes a couple of weeks to draw up the plans. It takes a few weeks to make up all the ropes. And, it kept me out of her hair for almost 10 months.
Would have taken me months or years instead of weeks. So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
really impressive.
So
I
Gene,
think my next one's going to be the Wanderer on the Rocks at Cutty Hunk. That'll be another long diorama.
how many whales would a boat like that accommodate typically? Do you know?
The Daisy is recorded at one point as cutting in 7 whales at once. And they had hawse pipes just aft of the topgallant forecastle, 2 on the starboard side and 1 on the port side. And what they would do, and this was pretty standard practice, American whaling techniques, equipment, and practices remained almost unchanged throughout the 19th century. Other countries adapted new techniques, the Americans didn't. But they would bring the whaleboats back to the mothership. The whaleboats would tow them back. They'd row back towing the whale. And then they'd chain them usually on the port side through that hawse hole. They'd chain them to each other to chains through the port side and cut in the whale on the starboard side. And then when that one was cut in, they simply cut the carcass loose and let it sink and brought another whale around. Sometimes in some ships, they had a secondary set of hawse pipes more towards the quarterdeck area. And they would sometimes chain a second whale behind the one they were cutting in to make it quicker to bring it up to cut in. But really, sometimes cutting in, it would be often 3 or 4 days before they finished cutting in, by which time the whales were shark eaten and stinking. And it was a disgusting, horrible process.
So before heading for home, how many whales could they process? Do you know?
Well, it depended on the size and it depended on the type of whale. They rated whales in terms of barrels. So a sort of medium size sperm whale would net 50 barrels. 100-barrel sperm whale would be very, very unusual. So somewhere in between. 50 barrels is a good one. And sometimes they would see a whale and they wouldn't bother with it. It was just too small because they had to lower the boats. So they would try to hunt. They'd hunt until they found a pod of whales on the surface sleeping. And then they'd sneak up in their whale boats, being very, very quiet as they approached the whales. They'd kill a whale and then they'd stake it with a marker as to whose whale it was, and they'd go after another whale. But then they had to bring them all back to the mothership. And if the mothership was upwind, they had to row. It was quite a job. So it would be sometimes a couple of days before they even got the whales back. And there's sharks coming right from the get-go. And so it depended on the size of the whale, but a ship of that type, it just 20, 30 whales wouldn't begin to fill the hold. The Daisy was interesting because she entered the market at the time the American whaling industry was in massive decline, but she was unusually profitable for a number of reasons. Probably the owner and skipper, Benjamin Cleveland, was just a notorious skinflint and didn't treat the crew well, didn't pay the crew well. But they also hunted sea elephants. Sea elephants produced an oil that was inferior to whale oil, but could be mixed with whale oil and be commercially acceptable. So in some literature, Daisy is referred to as a sea elephant hunter. And Cleveland would go down to South Georgia Island where the Norwegians and the British had whaling stations. They'd abandoned whale ships. They had stations, they processed the whales on land. And he had to get a permit to hunt sea elephants. And so he'd get a permit to hunt sea elephants limited to male sea elephants of a certain size, and then go out and kill every sea elephant he found by any means that he could, and then sneak away before going back, because he had to go back and report his load, then pay tax. So it was impossible to say, but basically by 1912, the whale population and the sea elephant population was already markedly diminished and in danger.
They could be at sea for quite some time then.
I'm sorry?
They could be at sea for quite some time.
I still didn't hear you.
They could be at sea for quite some time then, hunting whales.
How long was the voyage?
The usual voyage was 2 years.
2 years.
Daisy's voyage, 1912-13, was just over a year. And she never really returned to New Bedford. After she did a 1909 voyage, went back to New Bedford, went out to sea, and was down in the Caribbean. That's where Murphy joined him. And then he left Daisy after just over a year, but Daisy hadn't made it back to New Bedford yet. So a 2-year voyage was typical, and sometimes longer, because they stayed at sea until they were full.
Sometimes a couple of years and more. The whaling industry in New England started declining significantly in the late 40s, early 1840s, early 1850s. Does everybody know why that was?
I know what it was.
Precious metal. They found gold in California.
It was gold in
Took the ships to
California.
and the Yukon.
It was gold in California, followed by the Titusville Petroleum Strike, which was
Yep.
1860, followed by the Beaumont, Texas oil strike, which was about, I think, 1890. And whale oil remained in demand because it was used to lubricate watches, but the best oil was from the head of the sperm whale, the spermaceti, and that was used for lubricating watches. Probably still is.
How did they get that out of the skull of the whale? I think they hired the little
Well,
guys.
A sperm whale, a sperm whale's head is 1/3 of his body length. And it has a sperm whale. Most whales are filter feeders and eat plankton. A sperm whale eats squid. It's carnivorous. So it has a toothed jaw, which is underneath that massive head, really way back. It's almost 1/3 of the way back on its body. The whole front of the head is filled with complex structures that we still don't know the purpose of, that probably has to do with echolocation and sonar. To the sailors, what they were interested in was this area within that had this waxy substance. It looked like semen. That's how the whale got its name, spermaceti. And they would cut the head off the whale. If it was a small whale, like a 50-barrel whale, and they were a large enough ship, they might be able to bring the head onto deck. If not, they lashed it with chain to the side of the ship, and a man went down there while they cut the top of the head off and removed what they called the junk until they got into what was called the case. They would then cut into that and use small buckets to bail out the spermaceti. To the point where they would stop up the scuppers. You didn't waste a drop of that. That was boiled and handled completely separately. After they were done with that, while the carcass was still there, then they would take lances and they'd pierce the whale's abdomen multiple times, hoping to find ambergris, which they didn't often find. So, like I say, a bloody mess.
For sure. Great presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Well, hey, So thanks everyone for joining us. Look forward to next month. I guess that's it.
Have a good day, folks.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Good.
Presentation.
Good.
Thank you.
I
Great
agree.
presentation.
Stay well, get your vaccinations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good seeing everybody.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers.